went to a liberal arts school for undergrad, and one unique thing that it did was it required all non-liberal arts majors to take upper-level liberal arts classes. They did this by requiring idea seminars, classes that at the end required a 1,000-word paper that connected the subject of the class to the university's core values. As a result, even though the political science program only had 6 majors for most of the time I was a political science major, every single one of our classes had at least 20 students. One of those classes, actually my favorite, was called Terror and Revolution. It was a class where we dissected what terrorism means and how it applies to numerous ideologies over the 20th and 21st centuries. It was for this reason that the Fire Country, Sheriff Country crossover, The Finest and the Bravest, caught my eye. While people enjoy talking about the odd couple pairings like Bodhi and Boone, and quite a few talk about Bodhi triggering a very obvious trap, no one has used the word terrorism to talk about the crime in that episode, even though that's clearly what it is. It would be remiss of me if I didn't point out that people tend to call everything terrorism. Indeed, the criminal charge making terroristic threats, while serious and terrifying, has nothing to do with terrorism. Indeed, I think it's kind of muddied our cultural understanding of the issue. That's why this essay will look into what exactly terrorism is, before we dive into why this episode of TV, or I suppose 2 episodes, is such a fascinating study in what terrorism can look like on the micro level, and then we can get around to the question really being asked in this episode, which is it actually possible to divorce terrorism from the effects it has on innocent civilians? I was born in 1997, so by the time I was old enough to have a concept of scary things, terrorism was universally linked to the September 11th attacks, as well as the war on terror in the Middle East. However, terrorism as a concept has been academically studied all the way back in the mid-70s. We're talking about a time in America where movements on both sides of the political aisle were making statements via acts against civilian populace. While I frequently think about the Weathermen as the type of group the term terrorism was designed to study, the study actually came out of the Munich Olympic bombings and various other movements at the time, like the Rajneesh bioterror attack, which deliberately sickened people in order to stop them from voting in an election. The FBI defines terrorism and domestic terrorism separately, but I think the definitions are similar enough that we can synthesize them. Terrorism is an act of political violence against a civilian populace with the explicit purpose of causing political change. We sometimes use terrorism and political violence interchangeably, but really terrorism is one type of political violence, with insurrections and assassinations as other forms of political violence that frequently take place against members of the governing body. But it's the first category, attacking civilians for political purposes, that really describes what's taking place in The Finest and the Bravest, even if the eventual intention was to kill cops and firefighters. For a good portion of the first half of the crossover, we don't know anything about the political plot, and the violence that's inflicted within the story forces us to question whether acts of terrorism can actually avoid harming innocent civilians. A couple of months ago, I made a video about Edgewater and how the Leonis operate within Edgewater politics, but with the addition of Sheriff Country, it's important to re-examine the history and politics of this place. Edgewater was historically a company town, with the 2022 version of the story including abandoned mills and oil derricks, along with several still functioning lumber mills. We know that the lumber mills were owned by Fraley Enterprises, but we're not entirely sure about the mines or oil derricks. Something like half a generation after the Fraleys start building out the town, we have the Leonis at the helm of fire protection, starting with the first Vincent Leone and trickling all the way down to Bodhi. Edgewater has many old ranching families, and in the 70s, drug culture found its way into town, with the first of the growers wandering into town in the mid-1970s. Fast forward to 1987, and you've got a Leone as battalion chief of the Cal Fire Station, a Fraley as the head of Fraley Enterprises, either Fred Watkins or his immediate predecessor as the sheriff, Ruby Quinn being elected to a 4-year term on the Board of Supervisors in 87 before being impeached in 88, and Wes, Mama Joe, and Sam Henshaw as elders of the growers. Fire Country's backstory has always begun in the late 80s, but in today's instance, we care about when a company offered the county a substantial sum of money if they seized the Shasta Grove neighborhood and sold it. The county does just that, voting to pay each of the 20 families affected just $35,000 before taking their homes and having CAL FIRE, Walter included, burn them to the ground. It's possible that Sharon and Vince are involved since they likely became firefighters in the summer of 1988, but I feel like Sharon would remember this if she'd been involved since she would have been a probie. It is at this point that we can jump ahead to the day of the Boots and Badges baseball game in spring of 2026 and the kidnapping of kids on the bus at Edgewater High. It may have been 40 years, but look around us. We've got the same families leading the same institutions, with the institution of Mickey being taken in by Fred as a daughter and now running the sheriff's office. And before anyone yells at me because Sharon isn't a county supervisor like Ruby, I would like to point out that Sharon routinely operates through leveraging personal connections to accomplish her goals, which is exactly what politicians do. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because while I have laid out the careful history for you all, what I haven't laid out is just how that history interacts with the kidnapping plot and why this changes from it just being a kidnapping plot to a terror plot. Our crew are first alerted to the kidnapping plot in the middle of the annual Boots and Badges baseball game, where they hear an explosion and follow a plume of smoke to the explosion site. When they get there, they find a bus engulfed, and a quick investigation shows that the explosion happened in the middle of the roof. There were no casualties, but plenty of abandoned bags, and pretty soon parents are calling their kids. With the discovery of a flip phone in the debris field, there's no question that it was intentionally detonated during the game because they wanted it to be seen. It's not too long after that Mickey gets a call from a guy named Donald who demands a substantial sum of money and sends Mickey a live stream of the kids huddled in a storage container with seemingly no sign as to where they are. Mickey figures out the video feed is shaking, which gives her the idea to check out La Mirada Quarry. One quick Bodieism later, actually I like that term from TV Fanatic, I think I'll keep it, you've got a bunch of showy bombs going off and Bodie and Boone trapped alongside the victims. Unbeknownst to anyone until Bodie and Boone are trapped with them, the kidnappers didn't just throw the kids inside an empty box. Instead, the kids were left with food, games, and medicine. But they're kids. They're not going to be like, oh, let's play Scrabble while we patiently wait for the adults to come find us. They're scared, and that's why they huddled in the corner. While never stated, one could certainly extrapolate that the kidnappers were thinking they were taking care of the kids and only intending to blow up the responders. But this doesn't erase the level of fear these poor kids had when they were being kidnapped and forced to leave their belongings on the bus before being loaded into the storage container, but we'll get back to that. The money Donald asked for happened to be the exact amount in the county's reserve. When you hear people talk about governments having unencumbered budgets, this is what they're talking about. As someone who previously did a lot of work with county governments, this fund is essentially used as a sign of fiscal health for the county for bond ratings. It's used to get the county from point A to point B between tax collections and for unbudgeted spending that comes up throughout the year. The reason nobody but someone in the comptroller's office would know this number is because it takes into consideration the budget the board approves, the new tax rate the board approved, and the money currently sitting in the fund to create an estimate of what that money will look like. This is where something interesting happens, something that suggests that not all of the kidnappers have been on the same page. Mickey and the gang are able to pinpoint who from within the comptroller's office must have been the inside man, since there's only one guy with a kid the same age as the victims who conveniently didn't get on the bus. But during his interrogation, we learn he honestly thought that the kids were only going to be gone for a couple of hours until the ransom was paid. But that's not the only spot where one member of the group appears to have different motivations than the rest. While Donald is very careful to not let Mickey find out anything about their plot, Lawrence and Ray, the other two men involved, said loud enough for the kids to hear them that this would teach people not to mess with Shasta Grove. But when Boone and Bodie use the Scrabble tiles to communicate that phrase to the sheriff's office, Donald cuts the feed and we only get it back later through the help of Zane being able to hack the camera. Actually, when you look at it, it certainly seems like Donald intended to just leave the kids to die and potentially be dead before the sheriff's office puts it together. He sends Mickey to a field in the middle of nowhere and picks up the money via a drone. There were threats that tracking the money would lead to dead kids, and frankly, there's no reason to doubt this. I don't doubt that some piece of the plan was to get away scot-free, but I think Donald, whose real name was Paul Cresswell, by the way, suspected that they would eventually be caught. He just might be dead by then since he was dying of cancer. The group caught what could only be described as a lucky break, since I assume any FBI profiler worth their salt would have probably taken attendance for the day, realized the kid of the employee in the comptroller's office didn't go to school, found out that as a kid that employee lived in the same neighborhood as the bus driver, and eventually they would have started chasing that down as a lead. But instead, Mickey has to take the long way around to this information. This demonstrates the larger problem that this episode is trying to show in regards to the families that lost everything, and it's one that Fire Country has dealt with before. In the Fire Country episode Mama Bear, a former inmate attacks Sharon first at Smokey's and later by cutting her brakes. Not only does Sharon not recognize the guy, neither does Vince or Luke or Arthur, who are all standing right there. It's not until Sharon looks the guy up and sees his record that she fully remembers. Sure, we can say that things have changed in Edgewater. Fred was murdered and Walter has dementia, but that doesn't account for no one else remembering. When Ruby showed up to present-day La Mirada Quarry, she doesn't connect her daughter standing on an IED to the neighborhood she voted to destroy. Bodhi has stories of Walter responding to calls in the Shasta Grove neighborhood, but not of Walter burning down the community. Sharon would have been an older teenager at the time her mom made that decision, assuming that we're going with her becoming a firefighter in '88, yet has no memory, and we certainly don't have anyone from the Fraley clan calling in to be like, have you thought about this angle? Even Gina, Fred's office manager dating back to the 90s, doesn't connect the dots until the name Shasta Grove is shoved in their faces. It's not long until they're able to identify supposed kidnapping victim Candace Burke as being involved, and when Sharon finds a picture of Candace with 3 boys, they're able to quickly identify the rest of the crew. If even one person had remembered what happened at the quarry 40 years ago, they would have been miles ahead of what ended up happening. While it's true there was never supposed to be any direct statement that this was a terrorist attack related to Shasta Grove, it is undoubtable that Paul Cresswell intended Edgewater to know exactly why this crime took place. Indeed, there is absolutely no question that the destruction of their homes was one of the foundational childhood traumas of all 4, or I suppose 5 if we count Comptroller Guy, members of the crew, and I can't help but wonder if the people in charge's inability to figure out why this kidnapping is taking place is indeed proving the point of how this incredibly significant community event is nothing in the eyes of the people whose parents made it happen. The kidnapping crew recognizes themselves as children who were harmed by the decision of the adults in power, yet they don't recognize Sharon and Mickey as also being children in that time frame who didn't have any power of their own. Indeed, Mickey would have likely been just 4 or 5 years old, still searching for seashells with Maria, potentially younger than the kidnappers themselves. But you know what the kidnappers do recognize? That the children they are taking are children. Like I said, you could take the presence of board games, water, and medication to say that they don't want to hurt the children they are indiscriminately taking, just the children of the families in power at the time and the people who signed up to work alongside them in those institutions. But this is where the kidnappers go wrong. We know the kids aren't all happily waiting there. They're in tears because they think they're going to die, and then one of them almost does. We met Margot exactly 20 episodes earlier in the Fire Country Season 3 episode My Team. In that episode, she was also unfortunately the victim of an attack not directly aimed at her when she ended up glued into the Edgewater High Eagle mascot suit as a result of a cross prank war. While she is upset that she became a prank victim, she also spends that time asking Jake to help her with confidence and rolling her eyes when Violet flirted with him. Now compare that to what we see in The Finest and the Bravest. Margot was forced to leave her bag in the bus, and inside that bag was her EpiPen. Margot's allergy is to mold, and as she begins having difficulty breathing, Bodhi and Boone see a spot of mold. They search the med kit left by the kidnappers, and while it does have lots of minor medication, there's no epinephrine, no EpiPen, and even if there was Benadryl, oral Benadryl does not work fast enough to treat an anaphylactic reaction. For the purposes of this episode, it creates a really good justification for Jake to blow shit up, which is kind of a special skill that they introduced in season 1. But it also creates a danger because each of those blasts are causing the mold spores to be shaken from the edge of the shipping container into the air. Margot lives, but only because she was Jake's future sister-in-law, and they knew to get an EpiPen to her the second they pulled her out. Remember that the kidnappers' original plan didn't include the kids being able to communicate with the outside world, so had they not gotten incredibly lucky that Zane was able to hack into the camera, been able to use Scrabble's to communicate, and Margot's future brother-in-law hadn't been working the rescue, it's very likely that she would have lost her life in the terrorist attack, even if it was never intended. So here you have this seemingly perfectly constructed plot by members of the kidnapping ring in which they think the only people that are going to get hurt are the firefighters and police officers responding to it. Yet, none of them are hurt. Yes, Sharon did step on a landmine, but with how no one in the show ever gets industrial PTSD except, I suppose, Eve and Manny for a couple of episodes each, first responders walk away largely unharmed, while Margot very nearly died. Fire Country and Sheriff Country are both shows that are very heavily interested in the concept of compartmentalization. One of my favorite examples of this comes in the Sheriff Country episode Firewall, when Travis explains to Cassidy that he and Mickey kept a wall between their personal and professional lives in order to stay married as a public defender and a cop. Likewise, while we know that Walter was a monster towards his sons, Bodhi is basically treating the guy like a beloved old grandpa that is being bullied by his 2 uptight sons. In the very next episode, Bodhi expects Sharon to just get over the fact that Tyler killed Vince and is now living in Bodhi's apartment. But this episode reminds us that compartmentalization doesn't work. You can't prevent harm to innocent bystanders by constructing walls around them and hoping the explosion doesn't hit them. We see very clearly in the climax of the crossover, the explosions are still destroying the container that the kids are supposed to be safely held inside. Bodhi and Boone argue whether to allow the next hit in between every single blow, as they fear the container could come collapsing in and suffocate all of them at any moment. In the end, we do have a happy moment as all of the kids are reunited with their parents, and all 5 members of the kidnapping are likely going to prison for a very long time. Likewise, we have a happy moment at the end of Mama Bear with 3 Rock seemingly just regenerating to normal by the start of 2 Pink Lines and Odin being hauled back to prison. But in both Mama Bear and The Finest and the Bravest, there is this unease left in the viewer. Our cast had no idea that anyone would be after them, and they had to search for answers as to why they were being targeted. Meanwhile, in both episodes, the bad guy has a version of the story that they tell themselves about how their life was entirely ruined by the target of their terrorism. Paul never tells Mickey why. Likewise, Odin merely yells at Sharon for not remembering him. Ruby and Sharon wonder if there was something they could have done differently that wouldn't have led to this outcome, with Sharon even saying she deserved it for allowing the Mountain Tribune to write an article about her for her kidney fundraiser. I think there's a bit of psychological horror in both of these episodes, that in real life we all make bad decisions that aren't in the front of our minds at every minute, but someone else could be fashioning these into the reason why you ruined their life. That was an incredibly depressing way to end a video, so I may as well make this a little bit more depressing. I had promised that I would remake Vince Was Murdered, and I still want to, but I'm hoping that by the time we get around to that essay, the show is finished, or at least we have a lot more context about Walter, and I can add the context needed to that scene. Instead, I'm going to make a video about why I wasn't entirely sold on Sheriff Country in the first place, why I'm still not in love with it, and what I'm really hoping the show will get around to very quickly. I will see you guys in 2 weeks.